Update 14 is right around the corner, and Big Games has finally gave us a look into what we can expect to see in the summer update on.
I guess I will never watch that person's videos ever again. If it happens again, I will just quit streaming for today because I keep looking in YouTube to see like what's going on or whatever, and it's not telling me anything. Like, it doesn't say I have any copyright. I just deleted all the VODs for the past 3 days. So I don't know what else. If it was something like really bad, I would assume. Oh, hold on. What happened? Dog, the past 2 times I've tried to stream, it keeps saying, keeps going down due to policy violation. I don't know why. What do you mean soon I can stream on YouTube? I'm streaming right now. Or did it immediately go down again? Okay, I was about to man, fuck you. Okay. But I guess that person, I'm not allowed to watch their videos. I guess that is a... I guess that did come from a TV program, so I understand. So I guess I shall try to find another video. That makes me sad because I actually liked that guy. Trying to find a video. Fuck it.
Do
We'll
you know
watch
that
Justin
magic
Wang.
is real? Ever since I saw Papa Shango make black stuff drip down from the Ultimate Warrior's face back in the day, I knew that magic was real. You know how he did it? Bones. But animal bones won't do. Oh no. You see, you need real human bones. But sometimes you gotta be a little creative with how you get these bones. Take for instance the time a Tumblr witch came across some real human bones from a graveyard. So she decides that she's gonna take these bones and sell them on the internet so people can do magic with them. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the story of Bone Gazi. This video, one day in the middle of December of 2015, a Tumblr user made a hysterical call-out post. I know what you're thinking, what makes that different from any other day on Tumblr? Well, you see, this was a special call-out post. A post that would unleash the phenomenon known as the Bones Discourse, or Bongazi. The post, made by a user named Pastel Provera, read as follows. PSA. Tumblr user Little Fucking Monster is stealing human bones from cemeteries in Louisiana. Please don't let them get away with this and spread the word /signal boost. Now, as I alluded to before, calling people out on Tumblr is as common as breathing air. And this being a much more outrageous accusation than usual, some people thought it might have been a post satirizing the other call-out posts. But the ones willing to take it seriously at first needed some evidence. A reasonable approach considering it's the internet and anybody can say anything about anybody. Accusations are real easy to weaponize against people you don't like. The person accused, Little Fucking Monster, aka Ender, a self-described angry floofball with a love of kittens and BDSM, seems pretty much like if any of us were tasked with creating a hypothetical Tumblr person from scratch. Maybe they just pissed somebody off. No, as it turns out, there were receipts. And they were shared by a Tumblr user named NoPathFollowed. These receipts came in a form of a screenshot of a Facebook post from a private group called the Queer Witch Collective, which described itself as a collective of queer witches diverse in age, nationality, gender, race, class, ability, and more. To strive for a better community for everyone, we must acknowledge how privileges and oppression intersect across these labels. We are committing to forming an anti-oppressive / ethical space. As such, we actively combat forms of oppression, including but not limited to racism, ableism, sexism,
I
cissexism,
hate
classism,
racism.
colorism, casteism, etc. The post, made by Ender Darling, is as follows. Content warning. Graves. Bone hunting. Comment if there are added warnings needed. About 20 minutes from my house in New Orleans is what we call the poor man's graveyard. Most graveyards around here are full of above-ground graves because we live in a fishbowl, but there happens to be a graveyard where it's all in-ground graves. For those of us who are too poor to afford above-ground burial. When it rains, of course, bones wash up. The older the grave, the more you find. You can literally walk around and see femurs, teeth, jaws, skull caps, etc., etc. This is where I go to find my human bones. For curse work and general spells that require bone, I find human bones are easier for work with for me rather than animal bone. I can relate and work with the energy they carry, if that makes any sense. Anyways, I wanted to see if I started selling. Basically cover shipping to wherever you happen to be, if people would be interested. I know human bones aren't easy to come by, and I usually have leftovers. I only go once a month, or when it rains here. And at first, the responses actually seem kind of interested, but they're also kind of cautious because they're not sure if it's legal to just go buy bones from a Facebook person. I noticed that specifically one of the people wanted to know if you could buy bones in New York, where I'm from. So I had to know, can I buy bones in New York City? And the answer is yes. In fact, you can legally buy bones in any US state except for Georgia, Tennessee, and now Louisiana. And there are actually many websites that will sell them to you. Of course, I imagine that most of these websites aren't just finding whatever bones happen to wash up. But with the legal concerns out of the way, there are also some ethical concerns that people were bringing up. Not the ethics of, digging up unwitting people's corpses for magic, no. The ethics of whether or not you're doing magic good. An article by Vice describes one of the interactions that hasn't been archived. Others sought to ensure that Darling's practices were ethical by magical standards. Are you making any sort of offering or payment at the graveyard to the dead or the spirits of the land? One user questioned. I bring drink and honey and flowers, Darling responded, later clarifying that they never actually dig for bones, but merely take what they find along their path. Me and my goddess have a pact, Darling explained. She provides the bones, and I only take what the earth gives, and I leave offerings. And even this line of questioning was kind of crossing a boundary in the group. You see, part of fostering that anti-oppressive space that the group mentioned in their mission statement involved not questioning other people's practices. In theory, this was to prevent the shaming of magical traditions from other cultures. But consider that this cemetery was identified by a number of group members as Holt Cemetery, considered by some to be one of the most haunted cemeteries in all of New Orleans. A potter's field with a history of grave robbing due to the conditions that Ender described, and which was in a location that would most likely have a lot of poor black people buried. At that point, you gotta start wondering what's more important than maintaining an anti-oppressive space. Not questioning someone's magical techniques, or not digging up the bodies of dead black people to do magic with. The group was a bit divided on this issue, with some members outraged for the reasons I've outlined, while others defending it, saying that the bones would have wound up in the garbage anyway and this gives them more purpose. But ultimately, one user had enough and the group sprung a leak. This is a public alert. Seriously, anyone know this little shithead? Better tell her to stay the fuck out of Holt Cemetery or her bones might get broken. I am not joking. Please spread the word and keep a lookout for yet another fucking cultural vulture. For fuck's sake, I am furious. This was the post that would bring this story out of the privacy of the group and into the public sphere. And as a result, the group kicked everybody out. Hey witches, it's come to our attention that people in this group were leaking information outing members as witches / trans / survivors and or lurking the group. To solve this, we removed all the group members except the mod team. Feel free to re-add yourself. We will screen and re-add members ASAP. At this point though, it was a little too late to put the genie back in the bottle. This thing was spreading all over Tumblr. There were some people on there who were contributing their serious thoughts to the Bones discourse. Was chatting up my friend who is a literal voodoo boker about this bone and grave robbing thing. She's been following it herself, but says that there's some bad karma to be had by taking the bones of people outside your family. The bones of family and ancestors actually have a lot of power to give to the living if treated properly and with respect. She says the white soccer mom witch should have just stuck with asking the spirits for some of their grave dirt. Others were simply content to see the end of what some members considered the great meme drought of 2015. And even others were quick to point out something that honestly drives me up the wall online. You know, all the time I'll have people send me video ideas that are like, this person on the internet is doing something illegal and you should make a video exposing them. Like, here's an idea, how about you expose them to the fucking police? YouTubers are not the police, and as much as YouTubers are not the police, Tumblr users are even less the police. But as it turned out, the police were actually already on the case. WWL News, a local Louisiana television station, had been alerted to the case to the original witch who made the Facebook call-out post. In the course of their investigation, they spoke to Adam Stevenson, president of an organization called Save Our Cemeteries, a local group dedicated to the preservation of cemeteries in New Orleans. He mentioned that this is actually a surprisingly common issue, and he referred them to his contact at the Attorney General's office, Ryan Seidman. When asked about Benghazi, Seidman had this to say. We dealt with one of these problems last week, and this one came up this weekend, Seidman said. Seidman said that Holt Cemetery is one of the worst with this problem. He explained that it's because unlike other cemeteries in this city, the people are buried underground. The remains break down quickly, and there is a lot of turnover in the cemetery, Seidman added. The report also mentioned that despite what you may think, this is actually just a misdemeanor. So if the Attorney General and half of Tumblr on their ass, Ender Darling made a new Tumblr account to fight back, with a massive post entitled, "No, I am not digging up fucking graves, JFC." In the post, Ender insists that their original post was taken out of context, and by selling the bones, they just meant someone covering the shipping costs. They also go on to accuse their detractors of being racist. You see, the type of magic that Ender Darling practiced was indigenous, or as they called it, indigenous, which I guess is a type of indigenous person who watches Rick and Morty. They also allege that people are threatening both them and their child. And now, I fully believe that the threats did happen because I've seen it happen with much less egregious things than grave robbing. But I also hate so much that these kinds of things get singled out to be used as a get-out-of-jail-free card for valid criticism. They continued to say that they did not get the bones from Holt Cemetery, and reiterated that they did not dig up the bones, but rather they simply found them. They argued that they had seen a backhoe digging into the graves to make room for more bodies, and it would have been more disrespectful to just leave them there where they would have inevitably wound up in the trash. There's also a bit of a
Yeah, I helped you dumb bitches out. Yeah, you dumbass bitches should be thanking me.
of magic practiced in the Facebook group, with Ender saying that they thought this was a safe space for dark, indigenous magic, and not as they call it, Wiccan or fluffy magic. I am not Wiccan. I am not fluffy. I work with death and bones, curses and hexes, the dark, and the things not for the faint of heart. And you ain't about to shame me for it. Shots fired. They conclude the rant by accusing other groups in New Orleans of stealing way more bones than they did. And while Ender didn't corroborate that statement, it is backed up by claims by the Attorney General and the Cemetery Preservation Group. But regardless, the law cares not for whataboutism. Either you committed a crime or you didn't. And on January 28th of 2016, Ender Darling's home was raided by the police, where they found at least 11 human bones and 4 teeth placed on an altar. They also subpoenaed Ender's Facebook message history, revealing admissions that the collection of bones had been going on since at least November 16th, and where they had several interactions with people making plans to pick up the bones from their apartment, with at least 7 instances of the exact address being given to interested parties. Seemingly, the police had Ender dead to rights here, but if you asked Ender what happened, you'd think it was no biggie. In a phone interview with the New Orleans Advocate that March, Ender Darling had this to say. They were coming in seriously expecting to find bodies and human organs and have me and my roommates arrested for black marketing human remains, said Ender Darling, the self-styled witch, whose Facebook posts attracted a team of heavily armed lawmen to a mid-city home earlier this year. You should have seen their faces when they walked into the house and found a bunch of sleeping hippies. Several months later, Ender Darling was taken into police custody on July 15th and booked 2 weeks later with an $8,500 bail. Damn, I guess they should have cast some kind of spell that makes you not get arrested. It seemed that the passing of time made Ender think they got away with it, but the reality was the police were merely waiting for an analysis on the bones to determine whether or not they were really human remains. And it turned out they were real bones. But you know what? In the end, it didn't even matter. The only charges they could get to stick to Ender Darling were burglary and marijuana possession, which Ender pled guilty to. A 5-year suspended sentence was given for the burglary and 15 days were given for the marijuana possession, with credit for time served. And this was the last the internet heard from Ender Darling. But it was clear that something had to be done about this failure of the legal system to protect dead bodies. And thus, Louisiana State Representative Neil Reiser, himself a funeral homeowner, introduced the Louisiana Human Remains Protection and Control Act, which enacted stronger penalties on people caught stealing human remains with increasing severity for repeat offenders. I mean, me personally, I don't care what happens when I die. Use my bones for magic, throw me in the fucking garbage. I promise I'll be too dead to care. The soundtrack of the original Resident Evil to me is special in the sense that it's a horror game soundtrack that achieves the rare accomplishment of being cinematic and atmospheric while at the same time also being memorable. It seems like it's so often that a horror game OST can creep you out and be very atmospheric. They'll elevate the mood, but to me it seems like it's very rare, especially now, that any of the tracks really stick with you after you turn the game off. But Resident Evil had so many earworms. You got the save room music, the guardhouse basement, Rebecca's theme, Barry's Revenge. You got the end theme Still Dawn, which is probably one of my favorite video game songs of all time. And then you got the Resident Evil Director's Cut DualShock Edition soundtrack. That soundtrack is also special, but for very different reasons.
Do, do, do.
You gotta wonder, why is this song that sounds like Little Sneezer's fart trumpet from Tiny Toons? Why does this exist when Resident Evil already had a perfectly good soundtrack? And how does
Yeah.
it tie into perhaps the biggest hoax in the history of the Japanese music industry? Well, for this video, let's talk about the Japanese composer that got caught faking being deaf.
W.
So I was thinking about that Hudson Mohawk song from Reddit. You know, that really annoying song, there's that thing where the Redditor put it on his sex playlist. You know, that really annoying song that sounds like a seagull getting beaten to death in front of crying children by an elderly Englishman for stealing his chips.
Why, you little... I got you!
What the fuck?
Stop! He's already dead.
Time out. Check. Okay, we're still good. Had to make sure didn't get beamed.
I can't play the song because of copyright, but it's the one that goes like, heh, 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 heh. I don't know why I did it like Peter Griffin, but you get the point, you know the song. This guy puts it on his sex playlist, then he finds that his girlfriend hates it, and it winds up ruining the relationship. I don't want to do a video about that topic because it just got played out so fast, but it did remind me of another song. That song being the Mansion Basement song from the second re-release of Resident Evil Director's Cut DualShock Edition. Now that's the song that belongs on your sex playlist. Composed by Mamoru Samarogochi, a deaf composer, this soundtrack only really exists because Capcom was a bit light on bonus content for the third release of the game. The main control was the brand new controller vibrations, but that's really not enough to sell a game for the third time. You need a little bit more than that. But they'd pretty much shot their load on the first director's cut, so have a brand new soundtrack, I guess. So let's take a look at the soundtrack. I mean, you got the classic Mansion Basement song that everybody knows. The one that sounds like it's performed on an instrument made entirely of tuned butt cheeks farting. So you're telling me, this song was written by a deaf composer? No way. You gotta be kidding me. I had a friend when I was a kid who, for unknown reasons, would always kinda go like this. I don't know what this was. Whenever I hear that song, I think of that motion, and it's probably, if that motion made a sound, that song is the sound it would make. But the crappiness of this song has gone on to outshine a lot of the other fantastic turds that await you on this soundtrack. For example, you've got Barry's Conversation, which sounds like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. You got Wesker is Found, which sounds less like a song for a shady double-crosser and more like the theme for a mischievous kitty cat. And then you got the theme for the Black Tiger boss battle, which it sounds like the circus came to town and then the elephants got loose and trampled everybody to death. But that's not to say that the score is entirely without good tracks. You have one track that I think actually kind of beats its counterpart in the original, that one being Disappearance. This one to me sounds a lot more dark and foreboding and makes me think of something that might have been on the Sweet Home soundtrack. You got the Second Floor Mansion Revisited, which sounds like something that could have been on the Parasite Eve soundtrack. And then there's Rebecca's Safe in the Medical Room, which is probably my favorite track on this soundtrack. It reminds me a lot of something that you'd hear in a Fulci movie. In fact, it reminds me very specifically of certain songs from Manhattan Baby and The Beyond. The difference in quality between some of these tracks is so striking, it's almost as if two different people wrote it. But regardless of the quality of the soundtrack, its existence is a bit of an anomaly, as is its composer Mamoru Samarogochi, who with his hair sweep, shades, and baggy shirts Looks like a character that walked out of a Yakuza game. He looks like Hiroshi Tanahashi in a disguise living a double life. So let's take a look into this guy's story. Samaru Gochi was born in 1963 in Hiroshima to a couple of atomic bomb survivors. He was musically inclined from a very young age, creating compositions on a toy marimba that his parents had gotten him at 5 years old, and continued to compose throughout his childhood. According to a biography written about him by his record label Nippon Columbia, he was playing Beethoven and Bach by the age of 10, and through junior high and high school he taught himself music theory, harmony, counterpoint, instrumentation, and orchestration, and he declined to go to music school. He felt that it would have been a waste of his time. You see, he disliked modern classical music because he felt that, ironically, it was too atonal. He would instead continue to pursue his passion of making music as an adult by studying the work of Western classical composers. But then, tragedy strikes. He begins to suffer from severe migraine headaches that affect his hearing, and at the age of 24, he's diagnosed with a hearing disability with severe hearing loss in both ears. But despite this hurdle, not only does he keep pushing forward, but he demands to do things on his own terms. He's offered work composing for TV dramas, but he hated TV dramas. He turned them down because he felt these shows were garbage and he could do better. So instead, he worked at a video store and as a street sweeper, doing what he could to make money until he got a composition job that was up to his standards. That would come in 1997 with a film called Remembering the Cosmos Flower, a movie about a schoolgirl who gets AIDS from a blood.
What's your Discord name or there you go.
Blood transfusion. And then not long after, his second job would come, that being the infamous Resident Evil Director's Cut DualShock soundtrack. And regardless of how that soundtrack was received, Capcom would hire him again not long after, this time for Onimusha Warlords. But tragedy strikes once again. While working on the soundtrack with only 3 songs left to compose, Mamoru suffers from a seizure that causes him to lose almost all of what was left of his hearing. But using his perfect pitch, as well as subtitled scenes of dialogue from the game, he powers through and completes the soundtrack. And this soundtrack is like night and day from the Resident Evil DualShock soundtrack. It's fully orchestrated, completely competent, and basically what you would expect from a samurai video game. In particular, the track Rising Sun became very popular. And it was this soundtrack that propels him to a whole new level of prestige. With Time magazine dubbing him the Beethoven of Japan, they wrote an article that tells his story, as well as where he's at after having created the Onimusha soundtrack. Today, Samaru Gochi works in a tiny, dark room in his Yokohama apartment. The saddest thing for me is not to be able to hear an orchestra perform my work, he says. But then I think, I am composing not for myself, but to make other people happy. As he turns up the volume on an MD player for a visitor, tears fill his eyes as he strains to hear the rhythmic beat of the taiko drums. Percussive noises are the only ones he can detect anymore. Curiously, Samaru Gochi believes his hearing loss has made him a better composer. I am not distracted, he says. I listen to myself. If you trust your inner sense of sound, you create something that is truer. It is like communicating from the heart. Losing my hearing was a gift from God. I mean, if going completely deaf is the difference between the Resident Evil DualShock soundtrack and the Onimusha Warlords soundtrack, he's probably right. But it was his next major work that would propel him from being a guy who's known for making good video game soundtracks to a national hero. After becoming fully deaf, he discarded all 12 of the symphonies he had previously composed. And it's at this time that he begins teaching piano at a school for disabled children. Inspired by one of his students, he begins work on a new symphony, Symphony No. 1. Hiroshima, a tribute to the victims of the bombing. And as a second-generation Hiroshima survivor, he was uniquely qualified to make this tribute. Completed in 2003, it was first performed in 2008 when G8 leaders would visit Hiroshima to reflect upon what had happened there. But it gained greater significance in the years following. It's 2011. Nippon Columbia is gearing up for their 100th anniversary celebration. This would include several releases, one of which being Symphony No. 1 Hiroshima. Then on March 11th, 2011, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan hits, leading to the Fukushima nuclear disaster. This event makes the tribute to Hiroshima even more poignant. Samaru Gochi comments, "The nuclear plant crisis has revived before our eyes the horrors of radiation that may have been forgotten in Japan, the only country to have been attacked with nuclear weapons," he said. "Now, it is high time that people in the world once again look at Hiroshima." The symphony would be released on CD that summer, and it would sell 180,000 copies. That might not sound like a lot for a pop artist, but for a classical musician, that's basically unheard of. In classical music, if you sell a couple thousand copies, you're lucky. So at this point, Samaru Gochi is a bona fide sensation. And in the wake of this release, he has a documentary film crew following him around as he meets with victims of the disaster. The documentary, Melody and Soul, the composer who lost his hearing, would be released in 2013, and this would mark the peak of his fame. It would also mark the point at which everything began to crumble. June of 2013, Samaru Gochi is interviewed by a reporter from the magazine Era. This interview is never published because of two things that the reporter witnessed. The first thing was that Samaru Gochi would respond to the reporter's questions before the sign language interpreter was finished with their movements. And the other thing happened at the end of the interview. The taxi to bring the reporter back shows up. The driver rings the intercom. As soon as the intercom rings, Samaru Gochi reacts. He stands up immediately and says, "I'm here." How did the deaf composer that's famously very deaf hear the intercom? So being suspicious of the legitimacy of the entire story, the reporter opts to not publish the interview. Instead, the magazine publishes an article entitled, "The Lies of Samaru Gochi Seen Through by This Magazine."
Yes,
But at
Samaru
the time, that
Gochi.
article didn't amount to much, and Samaru Gochi's music was still being performed by orchestras around Japan. But it was during one of these performances that a composer named Takeo Noguchi noticed something else. This song, Symphony No. 1 Hiroshima, had plagiarized a bunch of other songs. Most flagrantly, work by Gustav Mahler. Noguchi wrote an article exposing this, but no music publications were willing to accept the article. You see, they were all sponsored by Samaru Gochi's label. So instead, it winds up being published by a news publication, Shincho 45, in November of 2013. But once again, at this time, it doesn't really amount to much. And now we're headed to 2014, the Winter Olympics in Sochi. Daisuke Takahashi, a figure skater representing Japan, was set to perform to one of Samaru Gochi's tracks, Sonatina for Violin, a composition that he had dedicated to a young violinist with a prosthetic arm named Miko Okubo. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, on February 5th, 2 days before the start of the Olympics, Samaru Gochi drops a bomb. Through his lawyer, Samaru Gochi had contacted NHK, the company that broadcast his documentary. In his correspondence, Samaru Gochi admits that since 1996, when working on his first movie soundtrack, Remembering the Cosmos Flower, he had been hiring a person to compose music for him. "I had to ask the person to help me for more than half the work, because the ear condition got..."
Oh, that's easy. You just unfriend them. What I did. I mean, seriously, that was the
got worse.
way.
He offered an apology and NHK apologized for ever having broadcast his documentary. However, at the time, he did not reveal the identity of the man who was secretly writing his music. But the next day, the man would reveal himself. Takashi Nigaki, a professor at the Toho Gakuen School of Music. At a press conference, he would give a rundown of their history together. It begins in 1996. Samaru Gochi had been looking for a composer's assistant, and Nigaki was the man who got the job. His first task? He's given a tape with a short theme for the movie, and he's asked to turn it into an orchestral piece. He noted that it's pretty common for composers to have assistants that'll help compose parts for different songs. But as the relationship continues, he demands more and more of him, where he's basically just making the whole thing. He'd give him descriptions of what he wants, with explanations like pursuit of abstract beauty in medieval religious music, rising music, musical harmony between dissonance and function adjustment, 4 themes, prayer, revelation, suffering, and chaos. and for a long time Nigaki went along with it. Having only made the equivalent of about 70,000 bucks over the course of 18 years, Nigaki explained that he didn't really care about the money. He was just excited to have work he made heard by people even if they didn't know it was by him. But throughout the years, Nigaki had become increasingly worried about the relationship, especially after the various expose articles that were written. He wanted out, but he claimed that Samaru Gochi threatened to kill himself if he stopped writing for him. Not knowing what to do at this point, Nigaki meets with that young violin player, Miku Okubo, and her family. He apologizes personally to them, but then he realizes that just wasn't enough, especially with the Olympics coming. You had this figure skater representing the country to the entire world about to skate to that song. It would be an even bigger disgrace for it to get exposed at that level, with these ramifications. So he knew that he had to publicly confess. He goes on to say that not only could Samaru Gochi not compose music at all, but he was faking his deafness entirely. At first he'd pretend to need sign language or lip reading, but as he'd get more engaged with the conversation, he'd drop the act. And eventually, when they'd meet, he just wouldn't even bother to pretend at all. The following week, in a handwritten letter, Samaru Gochi would claim that he was in fact deaf, but some of his hearing had returned over the course of the previous 3 years. He apologizes once again and goes on to hide from the public eye. And during this time, the story of how the Japanese Beethoven was a big fraud circulates all over the world. Capcom expresses their shock, as does his record label. And young Miku Okubo writes a letter stating that she's disgusted with him and adults in general, and she's going to give up playing the violin. Then a month later, Samaru Gochi finally emerges at a press conference of his own. He's clean shaven with short hair and no shades, just completely stripped of his formerly flamboyant persona. At the 2-hour-long press conference, he apologizes once again. He clarifies that although he did lie about the extent of his deafness, he does suffer from hearing loss. Just not enough to qualify for the legal definition of deafness, prompting him to return his certificate of level 2 physical disability. But he also said that Nigaki lied, that he was always asking for more money, that he exaggerated the degree to which Samaru Gochi was faking his deafness, and that he made up the suicide threats. And in response, he stated his intention to sue Nigaki for defamation, although no such lawsuit appears to have ever materialized. So what happens next? Nigaki, after spending nearly 2 decades in the shadows, gets to experience somewhat of a redemption arc. Later that month, he would perform live with Miku, who had in fact not given up violin. And 2 years later, in August of 2016, the first symphony written under his own name after the scandal was performed, Symphony No. 2, Litany. He would also return to the game industry in 2019, composing the theme song for the game Earth Defense Force Iron Rain. As for Samaru Gochi, you might be surprised that he's returned, somewhat recently actually. In October of 2020, a musical narrative series called Malleus Maleficarum appeared on YouTube. Although the music was at first uncredited, it would be revealed in February of 2021 that the music was in fact composed by Samaru Gochi. The producer of this product is Mr. Yasuyuki Hari, former chief producer of Fuji TV's documentary program The Nonfiction, who has worked on various works at the video production company However. Mr. Hari had the impression that Samaru Gochi was very soft-spoken and said, "I felt his passion for songwriting so strongly that I wanted to help him in my own way. I got involved." With photos of his new studio setup, Samaru Gochi expressed his gratitude for being able to produce music for the series. And when you listen to it, it doesn't sound like it was written by a guy with zero idea how to compose music. A long time has passed, who knows if he's up to his old tricks or not. But maybe he's not. I mean, there is something interesting to note. Although at this point, Samaru Gochi's name has been essentially wiped from everything he'd ever done previously, there's something that Nigaki said in his press conference that's often glossed over. During this press conference, he had stated that he had produced over 20 songs for Samaru Gochi. But the Resident Evil DualShock soundtrack has over 60 tracks alone. Onimusha Warlords over 40. Which means unless he had other assistants, he most likely produced some of these songs on his own. That would explain so much. But anyway, that's the story of the composer who faked being deaf.
Walt Disney once said that our greatest national resource is the minds of our children. I disagree. I mean, let's be real for a moment. There's a reason why we know all the stories on r/woke kids are made up. Children, on average, are basically the dumbest kind of person. But sometimes, a child's unique brand of stupidity causes them to discover something that an adult would never in a million years think to try. Take, for example, the street children of Zambia, who supposedly developed a concoction known as Jankum. It looks like a bottle of Nesquik, but I assure you that's not Nesquik. Rather, it's a bottle of fermented sewage that the children were allegedly inhaling for hallucinogenic effects. And in 2007, after a series of posts about it online, it became the subject of a widespread moral panic as people believed that it was suddenly showing up in suburban American schools. But how much of the story was actually true? Find out on this episode of Tales from the Internet.
Great taste with nutrition.
Jankum is probably one of the most requested topics for me to cover on this channel. You probably saw that yellow balloon and clicked immediately, but if you don't know what Jankum is, let me explain. Essentially, what people do, and you do not do this. Please. They fill a jar up with pee and boo, cap it with a balloon, and leave it out in the sun to ferment for a week or so. When your balloon is inflated, your Jankum is ready to enjoy, giving you visions of God only knows what. And the thing is, there's actually a lot of confusion over whether or not Jankum is real. It's often said to entirely be a hoax, such as in this article by SoberLiving.com, which concludes with the statement, "As an aside, the term jank has become quite popular with high school students lately. Kids will refer to something lame or bad as, 'That's janky.' Wow, hip slang too? What's next? Cockroach gin? Pea brownies? Sometimes I think I'm getting too old for this crazy world." That right there is a quality vintage boomer post. For the sake of this video, to put this question to rest, I was considering making my own in the name of science, but nah, it's just not worth it. But I don't think I had to actually make it, because it seems like there's a substantial amount of evidence supporting that, yeah, it is a real thing. In particular, the existence of Jankum as a street drug before any of this internet sensationalism was often covered in stories reporting on the plight of children in Africa. Outlets that mentioned it in the past were BBC, the New York Times, it made it into one UNICEF report. And the earliest known reference to it was published in 1995 by IPS, the Interpress Service. Sniffing sewage is a symptom of the desperate plight of Zambia's street children. There are thought to be some 75,000 in the country as a whole, a number that has doubled in the past 8 years. Nobody knows exactly where the idea for making Jankum came from, but it has been used by street children in Lusaka for at least 2 years. Nason Banda of the Drug Enforcement Agency is not proud when he says that it is unique to Zambia. He shudders when he sees the boys at the sewage ponds, scavenging for fecal matter to make Jankum. So without having to go and make my own bottle, I think there's enough evidence for me to say, yeah, this probably is a thing that people actually do, somewhere in the world. But the real controversy comes when it supposedly made its jump to the United States of America.